So our third speaker, John Lilic, did you? So he's based out of Hong Kong, and he works with ConsenSys in global business development and strategy. And he'll be talking about sort of what he's been doing in Asia and what he's been observing in the space.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is John. I guess I'm the ConsenSys guy, so thank you for having me. It's very nice to be here. It's funny, a couple of things I was noticing, lately Vlad Zamfir has been talking about governance and all sorts of things, and he's been questioning, like existential things about the technologies we're building, and I was thinking about that earlier because the coffee machine is like a technological dystopia. I don't know if any of you tried to use the high-tech coffee machine, but it's programmed to not work until 12 p.m. There's literally nothing you can do. Okay. So, so what I do at ConsenSys is, I used to do a lot more technical stuff before. These days I do more like business stuff, and I've been focused in the Asia-Pacific region. It just so happened to work out that way because I used to live in Hong Kong and I lived in Shanghai, and when ConsenSys started, there was nobody else that we had out of the handful of people that were around. So Joe sent me over there to try to figure out what to do. And over the years, I've learned a bunch of stuff, and hopefully I can share some of it with you guys today. I did this talk at SCC, but I think I did a crappy job, so hopefully I'll do a better job this time. I would say the current state of the market, one good way to build a mental model is you sort of have China, you have Japan, and then you have the rest of Asia Pacific. And we'll kind of dive into some of the differences there. With respect to Japan, and so over the last few years, I've been very fortunate to spend a lot of time in Japan, and I've learned quite a bit. First of all, the food is spectacular. The Japanese, like the French, get obsessive about high-quality food, so that's one really good reason to go. And not only do they make great Japanese food, but they make great everything else, like great pizza, great curry, everything else. And of course, there is a very large economic and demographic shift that's happening in the country. The Japanese are living much longer, much longer, and they are sort of not reproducing. And and so the birth rate is actually declining. And lots of what's happening in the economy is a reflection of that. And the reason that's interesting is because if we start to think about Ethereum, or if we accept the notion of Ethereum as a global settlement layer, and if we accept the notion of re-architecting a lot of the political, social, and economic operating protocols for the planet, it's really useful to try to understand what's going on at a high level. Very often, and this was my naive viewpoint before, I kept hearing, oh, quantitative easing, the Japanese government keeps pumping money into the economy and crypto is going to somehow save it. Actually, over the last 20 years, quantitative easing has been a spectacular success in Japan. And I'm not sure that crypto is going to come and save Japan from its spectacular success. So, and another thing you might hear quite often is that that Japan has a very high debt to GDP ratio, like 247% or something like that. And that's higher than most industrial nations. And this is also sort of a type of systemic risk that crypto could potentially save it from, when in fact the Bank of Japan owns tremendous amount of assets. I don't know if there's yeah, so there you go. It's sort of like, yes, they have a lot of debt, but they also own a lot of assets. And so Japan is actually much more stable than when we give it credit for. One really interesting example and an opportunity that I think our technologies could pursue is looking at, in detail, segments of the market in Japan where things tend to be very stable, but perhaps not liquid, like the REIT market, the real estate investment trust market, where there's $160, $170 billion worth of assets and maybe less than 20 million a day in trading volume. This is sort of like a perfect use case for decentralized exchanges and tokenization of assets. I would also like to highlight that Japan is going through a tremendous deregulatory or deregulation process. The energy sector, for example, TEPCO, which is the largest utility in Japan, it used to be a natural monopoly. The entire energy sector has been deregulating. So if we talk about the decentralization of the grid, and there's lots of instances of that happening in our ecosystem, of course, Grid Plus or Grid Singularity, the Parity project is going to launch very soon. It's a spectacular Ethereum derivative product. Grid Singularity, which is now the Energy Web Foundation. Grid Plus is a ConsenSys project as well, and there's others. And so Japan is a really interesting market in that context. And likewise, this is sort of another big deal too, the deregulation of the financial services market, in particular allowing non-bank firms to handle money transfers. So if you're going to be building applications that do things like allow fungibility of or really democratize liquidity and decentralized trading of assets that are fungible like tokens, this is sort of a really important thing for you to consider. And then also for those of you that are thinking about financial use cases, the world of APIs is opening in the Japanese banking sector at a pretty epic scale. And what's really interesting is Japan is certainly high tech, and that's sort of demonstrable, and we all know that. But actually, the financial sector is quite low tech. It's spectacularly low tech, and there's tremendous room for innovation. So this is a market I would certainly encourage everyone to really think about. There was a lot of speculation around Bitcoin, cryptomania, all of that kind of stuff, to the point where it was 0.3% of the GDP, according to Nomura, in 2018, which is kind of a non-trivial number. And so one of the things you'll discover if you are very talented software engineers or developers, there's a natural type of alignment that you can find between many friends in places like Tokyo and Osaka, where they have tremendous amounts of capital, but not a lot of strong software developer communities. We've had great success. I've been very fortunate to go to many places, including Tel Aviv. I spent a lot of time there. And we've had great success connecting a lot of the super smart Israeli techie people with Japanese investment and capital. So that's another area I would look at, particularly if your team's looking for partners. What you can do in 2019, I would say make friends with people in Japan for sure, and think about hiring someone who speaks Japanese. One of the things, unlike Hong Kong, unlike Singapore, unlike the Philippines, people in Japan don't really speak English very well. So that's an important part of your strategy, I would say. Okay, let's go to China real quick. So China, before we had the big speculative element, lots and lots of funny projects like these things popping up. Some of them, I remember I was like, no, I will not invest in Tron. Tron is stupid, I will not invest in it. Then it went up 30,000% or something ridiculous. So obviously there was a tremendous speculative element. We in our crypto community have, I think, particularly in the West, we have some naive notions about China, or especially around its governance and the way the government actually works. And we sort of say, well, they hate Bitcoin for these reasons, or now, for a host of reasons, when in fact, and they're trying to control and this and that, when in fact the Chinese government, and I found this out a couple of years ago, I mean, these guys are not politicians. They're all scientists and engineers, all the top-ranking members of the Politburo, most of the top-ranking members of the party, and China is going through a rapid transformation into a technocratic state, for better or worse. I'm not making a political commentary on whether it's a good thing or not. I'm just saying that once they understand the technology, once they craft what they think is sensible legislation that fits into their worldview, then it's like it's like a big go signal. And we're seeing that at a tremendous scale in China. And so one of the things that I think is happening right now is sort of a realignment towards, in particular, proof-of-stake systems. Recently, they've come out and said, well, proof of work is inefficient use of energy. I think this notion that, well, because all the mining operations are in the Sichuan area near the Three Gorge Dam, that they're just consuming clean power, so therefore Bitcoin is promoting clean power. That's kind of a silly argument because energy is still a scarce resource. So the government has recognized that resource should be repurposed for more useful things, and they've specifically identified Ethereum and its transition towards proof of stake and proof of stake systems in general. So I think we're entering into an age, as our technologies mature, okay, as we are able to deliver more efficient systems, where we're potentially going to find natural alignment with the government in China, and I think that's going to result in things like thousands of small, medium enterprises putting equity on the blockchain, for example. So hopefully that's a sensible worldview. I don't know, that's one that I've been developing lately. And then of course you can sort of see some of the activity, some of the news. And it's really interesting because I think in our ecosystem there's a disassociation between what the authorities are actually saying, what policy actually looks like, and what speculators who happen to own media publications are in the crypto space are actually putting out. Okay. And then finally, just to wrap things up a bit, I'll talk a little bit about the rest of Asia Pacific. And so I've been very fortunate to spend lots of time in the Philippines, other places like Vietnam. I spend lots and lots of time in Hong Kong, and in Thailand as well. And so the Philippines is a great example of, I guess it's a cliche, this technology hop thing, but actually they don't have legacy infrastructure like we do. There's 100 million people. It's the most heterogeneous population in Asia that natively speaks English, with 100 million people, and 70 million don't have any financial services. And because it's an archipelago, imagine living on a remote island, relegated to the local cash economy, in this case the Filipino peso, which you can't even exchange it for Hong Kong dollar. I mean, it's absolutely, the antithesis is the opposite of a hard currency. It's pretty much worthless, except in the Philippines. And so if you're relegated to that local cash economy in a remote island, you're sort of guaranteed to be poor forever. So we've done things like build I2I, which is a rural payments network. It just went live. There's 130 rural banks that have connected. The reason that's important and the reason it's built on Ethereum is because we spent lots of time in the province working with the rural banks and realized that it's very hard for them to stand up and maintain IT infrastructure. And when they settle, it's usually a person sort of manually inputting transaction data into a spreadsheet, emailing it to a big bank in Manila, and 52% of the time they make some kind of data input error. So the whole thing is messed up and it just doesn't work. This kind of an approach, I think throughout the region has a lot of promise. Likewise, this is a really interesting one, coins.ph. It's sort of like the Coinbase of the Philippines. I think they have 7 million customers now. So they've done a tremendous job, very quickly, very quick uptake. And it's kind of like 7 million users using a blockchain app that pretty much nobody's ever heard of. And then, of course, you see things like Thailand and lots of great development there. I think Vitalik spent time there, and many others from the Ethereum ecosystem have spent time there. And then when you look at other places like Vietnam, particularly on the technical side, there's just tremendous communities of developers, very smart people. And so you've got a robust region that is developing at a very rapid pace. And I would suggest that as you build your applications, as you build your products, this part of the world potentially could be your first go-to-market strategy. So thank you very much for your time. That's all I got.
Great. Thank you so much, John. I guess a lot of people would sort of think about Asia more in terms of like infrastructure. You've got Binance and you've got, it's the place where a lot of people have centralized infrastructure like WeChat. Is that sort of the observation that you've made having spent time in Australia versus, for example, in America where people sort of associate more with like cypherpunks and old school cryptographers? What's your view on that?
Well, my view is that irrespective of whether it's something like Binance or whether it's something truly very decentralized in this ethos that you're describing, and it might even be more like a Berlin Sea-based type of ethos. But the salient point, I think, is that in the United States or in Western Europe, we tend to think very highly of ourselves. If we build an application that has like 1 million users, it's like, oh my God, I have 1 million users. And then you meet these dudes in China and they've built applications routinely that have 50 million or 150 million users. So or in Vietnam, so the scale of it is very different. I think I think the competitive drive, the opportunity in the space is tremendous. Specifically for Australia too, what's really interesting is there's a lot of really good developers here, and there's a growing pool of talent. And I think looking into these markets, because I guess it's an 8 or 9 hour flight to Manila or Hong Kong, or 10 hours. That's like a short hop from here. So it's very accessible as far as Australia goes, and I would certainly look to pair the great developer talent that's brewing here to the market opportunities there, but also being mindful and learning from the developers up there, especially some of these people in China who have built applications that tens of millions of people routinely use.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.